With the Air India Flight 171 investigation, could inconsistencies with the RAT deployment in the government's investigation preliminary report actually exonerate the pilots from pilot error or deliberate downing of the aircraft? Now, in order to make sure that all of the facts and figures and ideas and hypotheses all stay within the official timestamps of the AAIB, the investigative body, I want to introduce you here to the concept of the sacred timeline, which I kind of got this from Marvel's Loki. And if you remember there, Loki worked for the TVA. That's the Time Variance Authority. And it's their job to make sure that nobody messes with this timeline or tries to screw anything up. Okay, so I made this chart here for you, and this is based off of the sacred timeline. Now, if you remember on my last video, I had this chart on here for you that I used, that I extracted all of these timestamps out of the AAIB's official preliminary report. So these are all of the times that everything happened. Now I want to lay it out visually for you onto the sacred timeline where there can be no errors, and I want to show you exactly visually what happened and what's going on here with the RAT and why some people think this is wrong and why they're questioning the preliminary report from India's AAIB, which is supposed to be the official source. Here at the very beginning, we have liftoff. The nose is up, and that happens at 8:08:39. And you can see both engine 1 and 2 are working just fine. They're green, so there's no problem there. And there's no sign of trouble until 3 seconds after liftoff. We're at 8:08:42. When two things happen here. A, you have engine 1 cut off, and B, you have the RAT deploys. So the RAT, for those of you who don't know, is the Ram Air Turbine. That's the little propeller generator that pops out of the bottom of the airplane. So it uses wind to generate power. At that same time is when both of these occurred, right? So now engine 1 is dead, engine 2 is still running. 1 second later, at 8:08:43 seconds, is when engine 2 cuts off. So now they're both off here. But remember, the RAT has deployed right here automatically. The plane automatically does it, just boom, starts right here. And then time goes by here, and then you can see the next update we have is right here at 8:08:47. So this is 5 seconds after the time that the engine cut off and that the RAT deployed. And it says in the report that the RAT began supplying power to the hydraulics at this point in time. So it took 5 seconds for the RAT to turn green, and it's now giving power to the hydraulics, okay? And so some people have a point of contention with this, so we're going to talk about this in a second, but I want to talk about the rest of this. So there was the discussion that says, why did you cut off? And the other pilot says, I didn't. And we don't know when it happened, but it must have happened somewhere in between these two points in time. That would be when somebody would notice it, is once both engines are now dead. And then you can see right here, the engine number 1 was switched back to run right here at 8:08:52 seconds. So a lot of people are also asking, why is there almost 10 seconds between the time that the engines died and somebody switched to run back on? And I think it's because the pilots were probably debating here what happened, where one pilot was asking the other one, why did you cut off? And the other one was denying that he cut off the engines. So that's going to eat up some seconds there. So by the time somebody realizes what's going on and then reaches over and actually activates the switch, that takes time too. So you're looking at 9 seconds that went by, and so now you're at 8:08:52 here. So that's why it took that long. At least that is my hypothesis. And so now, once that is turned back to run, engine 1 is starting to fire back up now, and we don't know how long it takes. It doesn't specify in the report, so I'm just kind of showing that in this time zone here on the timeline, engine 1 is coming back online. Engine 2 still has not reversed its deceleration, even though it is fired up, and at this point, both engines are fired up right here once engine number 2 is switched back to run. So they're both fired up right here, but engine 2 just didn't recover in time before the crash happened about 15 seconds or so later after this. So here is everything that happened visually on our sacred timeline. There is just one problem with this, folks, and let me show you what that is. Okay, so the problem stems here from the fact that the AAIB preliminary report, the actual reported time for the RAT to become active in supplying power is 5 seconds. But yet the aviation experts out there are all saying, no, not so fast. This is supposed to take 8 seconds. There's something wrong. So they're automatically becoming conspiracy theorists, and they're saying, well, the government's report is wrong and it's jumping to conclusions and blah, blah, blah. And they're saying all this. And this really has happened with human beings since the beginning of time. If they don't agree with what the Bible says, they're going to say the Bible's wrong. So if you come down here and look at the sacred timeline of what's really going on, let me show you visually what's really happening. So here's where the rat deployed right here, 3 seconds after liftoff, and here's where it's now supplying power right here. So if you look at what the aviation experts are saying and say, hey, it's really 8 seconds, then this is what it really should be. But the problem is it now takes that deployment in power time and it moves it 3 seconds this way, so that either this is wrong or something's wrong. But if we can't touch the sacred timeline, we have to leave that there, then something's about to happen here. So watch this, and watch this left side, what happens. So if we move this 8-second time slot here to align with the sacred timeline on the right side over here, look what happened to the left side. It moved the left side over 3 seconds now. So now the rat didn't really deploy 3 seconds after liftoff. The rat deployed right at liftoff. That's what they're saying. And I don't even know if that's really possible, because I thought you had to be in the air at least a few seconds or something because of the sensors that tell you when you're on the ground versus when you're in the air, because you don't want that thing deploying when it's on the ground. So do you see what they're saying here? So the people that want to espouse this particular scenario here is that, well, the rat deployed back here because there was already a problem with the engines. So what they are saying is that the pilots didn't commit a pilot error, and the pilots did not do this intentionally. What happened was they cut off the engine here. That's why the switch was cut off. It wasn't done intentionally or by error. They said they cut it off because the pilots saw that the rat had already deployed and that maybe they were getting sensors already. Now, that's a big if, because nothing in the report says the pilots noticed any sensors or that there were any sensor problems. All we knew was that the plane was flying at 180 knots at this time and there wasn't any known problems. So there's a lot of things that they try to shove into the narrative that don't seem to fit when you try to line them up with all of the rest of the facts. Right? So the question is, the other question I offer up is, okay, what if it was 8 seconds? Who says that it deployed there? How do you know which timeline point is wrong? How do you know it didn't do this, that it didn't deploy there, and that it really deployed over this way and turned on the power over here? How do we know that? See, so we really don't. And the other thing is, some people are saying, well, why would the rat deploy at the exact same timestamp as engine 1 cuts off over here? Well, probably, remember, the FDR, the flight data recorder, is collecting up all these data points, and it's taking, I believe, 1 second samples. So you could, in theory, remember, this is a 1 second from these two. It could happen any time in this timestamp area here. It doesn't necessarily have to be this. So it may have been rounded to there, but it could happen any time in there. And remember, it's the computer that does it automatically. So the very nanosecond that the computer detects something is wrong at this point, the computer will trigger the rat to automatically deploy before any human being could even reach the button to do it himself. So the question here is that it's really boiling down to here is, does it take the rat 5 seconds to start supplying power? Or does it take it 8 seconds to start supplying power? And this, I think, is really stemming from everybody out there. Even all the experts and the pilots are all saying the same thing, that it takes 8 seconds. But I'm saying, prove it to me. Find me one Boeing document where it says directly from Boeing, not paraphrased from somebody else, but on a Boeing stationery, that says how long the Ram Air Turbine takes to deploy. Does it take 5 seconds? Does it take 8 seconds? Could it take longer? Could it take shorter? Well, we don't know. Remember, let's just assume it's an advertised number. It might say on the spec sheet, it takes up to 8 seconds. But anyway, I have another reason for you why it may have turned on so quickly. Check this out. So this is a little chart that I made you to show you what would happen with the hydraulic pressure as it cuts off. So let's say right here at T = 0 is when the engine shuts off. Your pressure doesn't just instantly drop to 0. It goes on this curve, but the pressure is going to start dropping over a few seconds, and it might take 10 seconds for it to get all the way down to 0. And so let's say that this right here is when the rat was deployed right back here. Because remember, it happened at the same time that the engine shuts off, right? So the pressure's dropping, pressure's dropping, pressure's dropping. Meanwhile, the rat is kind of powering up, and boom, right here at this time, 5 seconds later, is when the rat is now activated at this point in time here. And so it's not likely to shoot straight up like this. It's probably going to kind of go more at an angle. But you can get the idea for what I'm showing you here, is that the hydraulic pressure likely did not drop all the way down to zero. The rat activates here, and now it's supplying enough power for the hydraulics to kick back in. So that's why it likely didn't take too long to bring everything back up to power, because the hydraulic pressure never dissipated all the way down to zero to begin with. So hopefully this explains to you at least one good, clear reason as to how in the world the rat could have got this thing back up to pressure so quickly. And we're only talking a 3-second difference anyway. So that's not too far off of what everybody thinks the number should be. If you want to protect the pilot and say, look, the pilot cut off the engine here because there was already a pre-existing condition happening over here, that could make sense. However, here's where the problem comes in, is from this point here to this point here, it wouldn't take 10 seconds. And the reason for this, and you've heard many pilots say this already, is when you have to cut off an engine in flight, you don't go to cut off and then wait forever and forever and forever. You go from cut off like this, and then you go right back to run again in order to reset the engine. And that's what automatically restarts it. Remember, the FADEC has taken control of everything from the minute you put it back on a run. It goes, oh, okay, let me start the sequence, and I'll get the engine back up and running in no time. It's not a sequence that takes 10 seconds. You don't sit there and go like this and wait a little bit and then go, let's put it back up. So that's why this doesn't line up to that theory at all. What we see here on the sacred timeline, this lines up more to the theory of somebody moved a switch and the other pilot said, why did you move that switch? Okay, so this is from Boeing's QRH here, which is the Quick Reference Handbook. So this is usually what they keep in their cockpit with them, and this is what they use as the steps that they take when something goes wrong. So when you have a dual engine fail or stall, this is what it says to do. Both switches. Move to cutoff, then run. It doesn't say move to cutoff, wait 10 seconds, and then put it back to run. So this is why I think it puts a hole in the theory of those people that think that, well, the pilot saw that there was a problem with the engine, so they put it to cutoff, but we don't know why it was 10 seconds later before they put it to run, because it doesn't say here to do that. And usually you want to be at about 250 knots when you're doing this. So this usually means you're up at a higher altitude and moving faster when you do this. So it's not likely that this situation would save you right at takeoff anyway. See, and then here is where they're talking about on the next page, the RAT automatic deployment. So it deploys automatically if any of the following occur. Both engines fail, all three hydraulic systems are low, or the loss of all electric power to the captain's and first officer's flight instruments, loss of all four of the EMPs, and the faults in the flight control system occur on approach, or a loss of all four EMPs and the engine fails on takeoff or landing. We can see in theory, now we don't know what that time frame is, but obviously both engines were working just fine at takeoff. As far as we know, the plane got up to 180 knots and everything seemed textbook and normal there. If you can find a better scenario, give it to me. But so far, these other scenarios that are offered up don't seem to line up to that sacred timeline. Now, hopefully by now, all you folks out there know the rules of the sacred timeline, because even Loki knows those rules. And what do those rules say? The rules say to be responsible and don't ruin the sacred timeline. So this means stop trying to change the timestamps in the preliminary report, because you can pretty much bet they've checked those out, they've vetted them, they've looked them over a number of times, and those timestamps are probably correct. Because if you can't trust those, then how can you trust any air crash report that's ever been done by anybody? And remember, these guys are all doing it to the same international standards. Unless they issue a correction, you can't correct the AAIB preliminary report. You can't correct those timestamps. You can't force scenarios in there that aren't really happening. Now, there's another problem that people are bringing up, but you can see that they're wrong because people just seem to have a problem parsing the English language. Here in the preliminary report, everybody seems to keep focusing on this almost useless piece of information about this FAA Special Airworthiness Information Bulletin, where it said that the fuel control switches were installed without the locking feature. But remember, this was only reported on model 737 airplanes, but they suggested that all the models be looked at, a whole bunch of different models, because they all use a similar, but again, not the same switch, like I pointed out on the last video. And everybody keeps focusing on this. Well, first of all, let me point out the concern was not considered an unsafe condition that would warrant a directive. So the airworthiness directive would have been a lot more severe. But this is what everybody focused on, is this one sentence right here. As per the information from Air India, the suggested inspections were not carried out as the SAIB was advisory and not mandatory. So right off the bat, everybody went on the attack and they go, oh, it's those cutoff switches. They're bad. They didn't check them. They're bad. Boeing's this, Boeing that. Because everybody just wants to blame Boeing, or they just want to blame Air India, but they don't want to blame the pilots. They don't want to even give a hint or even let loose in their brain and have a little openness and maybe consider that maybe there was a pilot error or a pilot sabotage. Because God forbid it, that could never happen. We're in India, we're the best pilots in the world, and we do everything to the book, and we're professional and all of this other stuff, right? So people just don't want to come to terms with it, so they want to blame everything else. So that's why they started going after Boeing, saying, well, this was a Boeing problem or this was an Air India problem. But this is what they didn't look at. They didn't look at this part right here. Otherwise, they wouldn't have made those ridiculous statements. The scrutiny of maintenance records revealed that the throttle control module was replaced on, this is the airplane, in 2019 and in 2023. However, the reason for the replacement was not linked to the fuel control switch, and there has been no defect reported pertaining to the fuel control switch since 2023 on this. So they replaced in 2023 last, and there has been no problems with it or complaints or anything. So this means you have a lot of people running around half-cocked out there, pretty much lying, saying that Air India never looked at this problem here on that airplane. Well, they've replaced the module twice. Now, let me show you what this module is. So this is their entire system here, and this is the thrust control module. It's the entire setup, including the two fuel cutoff switches here. So this entire module was replaced in 2019 and in 2023. So they could not possibly have whatever problem switches they thought that existed years ago back in 2018, because the system has been updated twice since then, presumably to the latest model of the part number for this. So it wouldn't even come into question that there's a problem with the fuel control switches. So I think everybody just needs to lay off on this whole theory that there was something wrong with these switches. It appears that the switches did their job, and it appears that the engines did their job as well. See, and then when you look at the exploded view, like this whole thing is ordered as one entire piece, and it includes your fuel cutoff switches right here. So now when you come back and look at the report, and it says this throttle control module was replaced in 2019 and 2023. So my problem then is, why don't these people mention that? You know, because they all have an agenda. Everybody seems to have an agenda here. Yeah, some people just want to blame Boeing at all costs, no matter what. Some people just want to blame Air India at all costs, no matter what. Some people just want to blame the pilots at all costs, no matter what. Okay. So I'm here more for the truth. I'm not here for nonsense. And I just refuse to tolerate when I see people doing stuff like this. They don't know how to read, and then they make these false assumptions, and everybody goes haywire over it, and it just starts arguments and debates all over the world. Okay, now here's another thing that a lot of people might not be considering, because I don't think people realize the difference between the Boeing 787 and all of its previous models. What happens here with the hydraulics on the older models, those are all engine-driven pumps, you see. So those can take a lot longer to power back up. And I would think even if you have the RAT for the hydraulic power output, who knows how long it really takes those guys to get those systems back up. It's not very clear here. Boeing 787, these are electric motor-driven pumps. They don't rely on the engine operating. So these can come right up fairly quickly. And that's where the RAT is supplying that electrical power to those electric motor-driven pumps. So the hydraulics come up faster. So what I'm saying here is that here on flight AI 171, you have both engines cut out here, 42 to 43. The RAT began supplying hydraulic power 5 seconds later at 8:47. Therefore, without the RAT, the aircraft would have had a window of roughly 5 to 8 seconds of diminishing hydraulic response. And so this then aligns with the pilots in the simulations, showing initial loss of control authority before the RAT catches that system and brings it back. And if you look at some of the other aircraft, so Airbus A320, it says here you would have 8 to 10 seconds if the RAT did not deploy, is how long it would take to get down to zero. The Boeing 767 and the 777 would take 6 to 8 seconds. Okay, and then the Boeing 787 could take 5 to 8 seconds. And then remember, because of that initial uproar over that preliminary report, the Indian government last week told all the airlines to go out and check these stupid switches. And so here's what happened. So just yesterday, we see a story here. Air India says no issues in the locking mechanism of fuel control switches in the Boeing fleet. So they've checked all of theirs. It says right here, they had completed precautionary inspections on the locking mechanism of the fuel control switches for select Boeing aircrafts with no issues found. And then another conspiracy theory which is ironically put forward by the pilots union here, is that the AAIB is jumping to conclusions, which they're not. They didn't say anybody did anything. They only reported what was in the data recorder. And look, if you don't like the numbers that are in the recorder, if you don't like what it says, that's too bad, because that's what happened. Flight data recorders don't lie. They tell the truth. And so there weren't any conclusions jumped to. But of course, some of the conspiracy theory people out there are saying, well, this is just because of these big pockets of Air India are trying to control the story and move it to the pilots and blame the pilots to take the problem off of them. Well, that's a stupid story. And I think you and I can figure that out already, right? Because it doesn't matter if the pilots made pilot error or if the pilots did this deliberately. It's Air India's fault, right? They're the ones who are liable anyway, and they're going to get their shirts sewed off their backs no matter what. So putting the blame to the pilots over here does not shift the blame from Air India, because Air India is the pilots, basically. Duh. So why people make really uninformed comments like that is just unbelievable. And remember, this came from the pilots union. And this was the same guy that told us, don't speculate, wait for the final report and don't speculate. And then he turns around a minute later and starts speculating about some software bug that happened 5-6 years ago and says, this is the problem right here. And after he told us not to speculate. So you're just seeing so much nonsense going on out there, folks. And we're trying to keep it on the straight and narrow for you.